So it says good pairs. It doesn't have to be good pairs. It could be a lot of fonts, but usually we have a headline font and a text font. And Bethany Heck will explain later on that it doesn't always have to be like this. But for now, let's look at how to choose a first font anyway. So a first typeface. So the personality is really important. Two different ways you can write the same message, a very different message with using different fonts, like here. Eric Spiekerman has this graphic for the shoes that you don't always wear the same shoes every day. What party are you going to? Font is kind of the same way, that if you have this kind of childish, I sort of find it really disrespectful if you get teachers' emails that are just using Comic Sans because that's the only font they could find on the web, on their system, that sort of look too. As a German, I can see this like Frakturface below here, that is black letters in English. It's displaying to me sort of an old German style, and it was used to as being very German, as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church that used more of a serif typeface. So the Germans kept using the Frakturface because they were Protestant and not Roman Catholic. So that's why it became popular in Germany. But eventually, of course, it changed to something more modern. They caught up with the times. So any kind of Asian market has this like cheesy brush script font. Doesn't matter what Asian country they're talking about. It's all like kind of one big pot. And the corporate companies use sans serif fonts, like the Trade Gothic here is very popular for financial statements, for example. Then we have a hipster cafe font that's more handmade looking, and were called Egyptian because they came from there. More type just overview in general. Let's start at the top right here with sans serifs. Sans means without a serif, so they're just straight lines, and they were mostly designed in the 20th century. They became popular because after the wars, there was sort of a belief that all this ideology has led into this. How they started at the top right here with sans serifs. Sans means without a serif. So they're just straight lines, and they were mostly designed in the 20th century. They became popular because after the wars, there was sort of a belief that all this ideology has led into this trouble with the wars, and they wanted a typeface that doesn't have this personality and was just plain and just gave the message across. So the new idea was also democracy. So these typefaces do look more democratic. They're trying to have a stability, a reason, and they look more like what's currently out there. Industrial as well because of the 20th century. And when you make them modern, that means modern for back then. It's not like the latest anymore because you have a very low X height here in the word chic, for example. Brandon is actually a pretty current typeface. So there's a renaissance of these typefaces that were designed around the 20s and 30s. And then I would say display fonts on the bottom here are fonts you cannot really use for text. They're headlines only. For example, Cooper became so popular because when you put these on a storefront, these letters, it doesn't matter if one letter is a little lower or not exactly. It still looks fine even if it's wobbly. That's one of the reasons why this typeface became very popular as a store. And if you look around, you find it everywhere. Or Unique is a typeface by Neville Brody. He used computer technology to blur the typefaces, and it was sort of in 80s look because it's the first time that this was technically possible with a computer to create these fonts. So quite often you can see in a font what the time of the technical innovations were around. So it makes it typical for that time, and the message will convey that as well. So moving on to scripts, they are for wedding invitations. They're elegant, they're maybe creative, they're hard to read. Don't use them for text on the web. I find that really funny to look at sometimes. I don't know, not a good choice, I would say. And slab serifs are pretty much sans serifs, and then they just slapped on kind of a bar at the terminal of the letter, of the end of the letter. And they look more crafty, do-it-yourself magazine kind of style. And then the serif, the old style, Roman Catholic kind of look, it displays tradition, trust, luxury. A serif means that this was used from the Romans to chisel in stone, kind of get the same baseline of all the letters across. So they could use just the length of one of their chisels to kind of clean up the end of the letters. The Greeks didn't do that, but the Romans did. So in Italy, the fashion, of course, was very popular. So Vogue uses this as their magazine headline because fashion in Italy kind of connects to this whole world. So that's the look of serifs, tradition, trust, and luxury. Slab serifs, like I said, more on a do-it-yourself, like travel websites or like that, modern products. Democratic sans serifs without serifs used in a lot of corporate websites. Here's a guy, Massimo Vignelli, New York designer who designed the New York MTA signage. He was famous for only using 6 typefaces because he thought it was better to know 6 typefaces well than having hundreds of typefaces around and just use them too random. He was always upset with the MTA at the end because they didn't have the money to have him decide on all of his corporate identity, so they would give it to other sign makers who kept mixing up Franklin Gothic with Helvetica, and you can still see that in the New York in the subway when you go down. It's very inconsistent if you keep looking for the details. It's kind of funny, made him mad. But he's a super nice guy if you want to Google him, and on YouTube there are a bunch of films about him. So the content is important. What is the genre that you're talking about? Because the first look, when you look at something, that will be the first impression. The typeface will sort of tell you what this is about. You don't have to, if it's the wrong message, you might not continue reading it because you might not be interested in that topic or so. The context is important because you need to know who you're talking to, what your audience is familiar with, because some typefaces that you know are easier to read because it's so used to it. If you have a novel, you have a serif typeface, you kind of get into the mood of it. But if you have a financial statement, you want to know that this is in a sans serif. It gives you sort of the context of trusting that institution more. Then functionality is sort of just a technical. On the screen is usually further away from us, so the typefaces by default in the browser are already 16 pixels. Just because it's further away, but it really depends. On the phone now, we have it almost at the same distance than a book. So this functionality might have to consider what's most readable for what you want to try to build there. The X height, it's important. The character width, if it's too extended or too narrow, it's harder to read. The weight, how thick and bold. You don't want to set the whole text in a really bold typeface. It would be very hard on the eye, but you have a headline that stands out a few words, then that's very comfortable and very effective. The contrast between the strokes is the one on the left is more even, the verticals and the horizontals, where the Bodoni on the right has very, very thin vertical strokes. So the design traits, of course, if they're like funny quirks in it, that every time you see this letter, you like sort of stop over it because you find it unusual that there's something weird in this letter that might be pretty for some typefaces, but in a longer text that might be disruptive. The counter shapes are the insides of the shapes that are important. So the negative spaces, if they're bigger, they're also easier to read. Serifs or sans serifs, there was a debate which one's easier to read. I don't think anyone won this debate ever, and they're both equally easy to read. So the legibility is related also, of course, to the size of the letter. And then upper letters are like caps. All caps letters are harder to read than upper and lower cases because the way we scan the shapes of the words. The line space between the text is important. If it's too tight, it might be hard to read. If it's too far apart, it might be hard to connect that as well. That looks wrong. The length of a line is how comfortable can you read one line. Color, contrast of type on a color or even on a photo is very important, as you can see. So the many designers said that good design is good communication. I forgot who was this, but I could probably find a bunch of people that said that. They don't always blame yet the user for not understanding it. They blame the designer for making it wrong, or sort of like blaming the teacher for not teaching you anything, or did you just not pay attention? But anyway, in this case, I would say it's important, yes, the designer needs to have a good design to make it understandable. Usually, if you're noticing that something is wrong, it's because the design is bad. Usually, if the design is great, you don't even notice anything. A design when I look at it and see what this would be in a dance or a song or a painting. Is this painting like always like going straight, or are there parts in this design that my eye is unconsciously drawn to that are supposed to or not? I also like to think like, what if the whole thing fell down on the floor? Which way would it break? Is that the way I intended to break? Do I want this tension, or do I want it to be very stable? For the web fonts, some of them are very pricey, like Dot and Mog, but there are a lot of, I'm posting a whole list of URLs of free fonts as well. Then Bethany Hack goes into a big detail about using more fonts. Of course, there's pros and cons to that. If you have too many, it becomes like a ransom note, and also loading times might be a problem. But also you might want to use more than two, because on the web there's really more than headline and text. There's also like a whole interactive part, which is a whole another section, which also has headlines and text. So if you break it up, you already have four here. And then you have captions, you could have quotes and all this. So there are many more instances where you might want to add another font.